MacuHealth is a nutritional supplement leader. Our targeted formulas include MacuHealth for daily eye health, MacuHealth Plus for aging eye support, Vitreous Health for vitreous care, Vision Edge Pro for visual performance in athletes, TG Omega-3 for ocular and systemic wellness, and MacuHealth DM for eye and metabolic support. Call MacuHealth today and mention this podcast for special discounts. Experience the difference with MacuHealth. Nutrition you can see.
With more screen usage and indoor time, myopia, also known as nearsightedness, is increasing and getting worse in children. Now, certified eye doctors can prescribe MiSight One Day, the first and only FDA-approved soft contact lens to slow myopia progression in age-appropriate children. Visit CooperVision.com to find a Brilliant Futures certified eye doctor near you. Do your patients know what presbyopia is?
There are people who are afraid of the press.
Have you talked to your patients about multifocal contact lenses?
I've heard the bifocal, but not multifocal.
Exactly, not multifocal.
Do you need help with your multifocal strategy? Learn more at the conclusion of this episode. Hello and welcome to the Dr. Kerry Gelb Open Your Eyes podcast. I'm Dr. Kerry Gelb, the host of the documentary Open Your Eyes. If you enjoy our interviews, press like, subscribe, share, and hit the bell for updates on new episodes. Great news, you can watch our full-length documentary, Open Your Eyes, and it's now streaming on Amazon Prime, Apple TV, iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube Movies. And visit my website, wellness1280.com, for all guest links, resources, and past episodes. And I'd love to hear from you, so reach out to me anytime at drkerrygelb@gmail.com. That's drkerrygelb@gmail.com. So right now, please sit back and enjoy my conversation on a very interesting topic, NAD, with Dr. Andrew Salzman. NAD is often called the centerpiece of biology, vital for producing cellular energy, neutralizing oxidative stress, and protecting us from cancer. But here's the problem. By age 50, our NAD levels are cut in half, and they keep falling as we get older. The result, brain fog, chronic fatigue, and even an increased risk of macular degeneration. Today's guest, Dr. Andrew Salzman, MD, a Harvard-trained physician and world-renowned NAD expert, has spent nearly 40 years studying this molecule. He's authored over 170 clinical studies, earned more than 50 patents, and has helped pioneer the first treatment for BRCA-related cancers. What if this one molecule could help energy and improve longevity? Dr. Salzman is here to unveil what may be the missing piece. Dr. Salzman, welcome to the Open Your Eyes podcast with Dr. Kerry Gelb.
Thanks. Great to be here.
You know, Dr. Salzman, I'm very, very interested in NAD, but I got to admit, before we get into what it is, it gets very, very confusing because there's NAD plus, NADH, NADP, NADPH. Do we have to know the differences between all that to understand what NAD is?
Well, we really do, because we have different functions in the cell and in the body, but they're all connected in one sense, and that they're all built ultimately from NAD. But each one of those has a unique character and personality and role. So yes, it is important to talk about those.
So give us, our audience, a background. Tell us about each one of them, what each one of them is important for, because as we go through the podcast, you may be using those terms. Sometimes they're used interchangeably by some people that don't really understand the differences, but it gets confusing because there's all these different terms that sound alike.
Of course. Yeah. So the core molecule that we're talking about today is NAD. But that comes actually in two forms. There's NAD plus, and then there's NADH. And in the case of NADH, there's already a proton attached to it. And then when it cycles and does its thing in the cell, the H comes off and comes back on, and there are mechanisms to do that. So it's really the same molecule, but in two slightly different forms. When you add NADP, when you add a phosphate to this, NADPH is a little bit different. It's sort of a second cousin, if you will. And in that case, the NADP has a separate role, which is much more involved in preventing oxidant stress. So if we think about them today, We'll talk about NAD and what its role is there, and then we'll talk about NADP. One other thing, NADP is also important in the management of nitric oxide, which is a very important gas, has a lot of different physiological and pathological roles in the body. So we will be talking about NADP later in the discussion, and specifically as it relates to nitric oxide.
So what are the three main things that NAD does for the body?
Well, first of all, it's involved with energy. It is absolutely the core, central organizing part of how we produce energy, how we store it, and how we use it. So, for example, when we're using our muscles or using our mind, using our brain, when we're digesting, all of the myriad activities that we have that involve energy, NAD is the focal point of that. So, energy, first and foremost. Second thing that NAD does is it gets involved in the oxidant protection. We are surrounded by oxygen. We're oxygen breathing animals. And as such, we're always subject or susceptible to a little bit too much of oxygen stress, or oxidant stress as it's known. And so we have a variety of mechanisms that have been incorporated into our tissues and our body that protect us all the time from this kind of oxygen injury. And NAD, when it forms NADP, is able to single-handedly deal with most of that oxidant stress. So it's a critical molecule for that purpose. The last purpose is its role in cancer. And I can't say enough about this. So when you are subject to injury to your genetics, which is happening every second, I mean, there are cosmic rays, there's oxidant stress. Our genes are always under stress and they're always being injured. And there are mechanisms that we have in every cell to take care of that, so that our cells remain intact and we don't have any genetic injury. The mechanism for protecting that is an enzyme in the nucleus called PARP, P-A-R-P. PARP is like a surveillance. It's always looking for evidence of damage. When it identifies a problem, it immediately sets right onto that and uses NAD in order to correct and repair that injury. So NAD is critical in maintaining genomic integrity, preventing gene damage, stopping us from ultimately developing a malignancy. So those are the three major points. Of course, there are many others that we'll touch on today, but those are the three drivers that we talk about initially.
Let's go back to energy. As people get older, they start to lose their energy. You look at a child, they're running around like a maniac. And then you look at an 80-year-old man who could barely sometimes get out of a chair.
Yes.
What happens to our energy, and why is that happening as people get older?
Well, there are really two main causes of sort of a slowdown, if you will, in our ability to create energy and use it. One of them is just the fact that our mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, tend to get lower over time. So that when we're looking at a 20-year-old and an 80-year-old, there's a striking difference in the concentration of these powerhouses within our muscles, within our mind, within all of our cells. So we slow down to that effect. But even more importantly and fundamentally, the NAD levels, which govern our energy, are slipping away from us. If you take a 20-year-old, as you said, you're full of energy. Your NAD levels are high. You're able to do whatever you want to do, whether it's to run, to think, to jump, and so forth. But over time, by the time we're in our 30s and 40s, we start to see that go down. There's a diminution of the NAD levels. By the time we're, let's say, 50 or 60, they're only half. And thereafter, it only gets worse. So that's a major reason why we can't generate energy, because we don't have the core tool that's used in the body to create energy. It's just missing. It's lost. And we'll talk a lot today about where it goes, what happened, why did it disappear.
And we're going to talk about a product that you helped develop in a little bit, but I want to ask you about niacin, vitamin B3. Is taking a B complex or taking niacin enough to build NAD?
Yes and no. There are two reasons the NAD levels slip away and fall as we age. One is that we're not making enough, we're not getting enough. And the other is that we're starting to break it down. When we're talking about niacin and other B3 supplements, what we're talking about there is making enough, getting enough into us. Some niacin is available in our diet. It's a precursor. It's one of the original products that's required in order to transfer into NAD. So we need to have some in our diet. People who don't get any get seriously ill. They get pellagra. But it's not enough just to have some niacin. There are also a lot of transformations along the way that ultimately get us to NAD. So if you load up on niacin, you load up on B3, it's not enough. And we'll talk about that. You don't get quite the boost you need. In order to really bump up and get the proper NAD levels initially, you need supplements if you're getting older. So, for example, you can take our product, you can take NMN, you can take NR. We'll talk about the different varieties, but all of these are precursors. They're early forms of the NAD. They get converted into NAD once you swallow them or absorb them.
Now, NAD helps regulate sirtuins. If you could explain what sirtuins is and why that's important.
Well, there are a number of different sirtuins. There are actually a whole group of them. And these are enzymes present in every cell, and they change various enzymes and proteins by modifying them in a specific way. And in order for that to happen, they have a cofactor requirement. They need NAD attached to them. It sticks to them. And having stuck there, it can then do its thing and go out and modify enzymes, many of which are involved in metabolism and physiology. And most recently, now we understand they're involved in aging. So NAD sufficiency is required for sirtuins to do their job in keeping us young.
Now, if we there's my understanding is there's seven sirtuins
That's right.
that affect different parts of the cell.
That's
Uh,
right.
different parts upregulate and downregulate key genes. If we can regulate the sirtuins and NAD, theoretically, can we slow aging?
Aging, to some extent, is a built-in, baked-in, evolutionarily focused event. I mean, all organisms die. All plants and animals ultimately succumb. However, at wildly different rates. If you look out in the animal kingdom, you'll see animals that live for 2 weeks. Worms, flies, bees, highly active, full of energy, vigorous, out there doing their thing, and then they succumb within a few weeks. On the other hand, you'll find animals which have an extraordinary longevity. There are trees that are 2,000 years old. There's the lake shark in the Arctic, which goes to 400 years old. There are tortoises, which are 150 to 200 years. So there's this huge span where organisms have evolved to fill a niche. Either they're very short lived or very long. And so that is preset. You're not going to find a person who's going to live to 800. However, it is possible to alter this a little bit, even maybe significantly. Right now, most people die between the ages of 90 to, let's say, 100 at best. But if we were able to really attack the fundamental drivers of aging, maybe we can move that to 140 or 160. So that's theoretically possible. And I suspect, in fact, I predict that within 15 to 20 years, the average length span in the US will be significantly longer as we better understand it and make these interventions.
NADPH increases or helps make glutathione. I did a whole podcast on glutathione with Dr. Guilford. Glutathione is such an important molecule. Explain about glutathione and why it's so important that NAD make glutathione.
Well, the best way that we first saw that it's critical is you can actually alter an animal, a mouse, and remove its ability to make glutathione. So there are actually examples of altered animals which lack that. And these animals, not surprisingly, are incredibly susceptible to any type of oxidant stress. Even a mild stress that wouldn't encumber us in any way or shape has a dramatic negative effect in these animals. It is the most critical and abundant antioxidant in all our cells. It's in every cell. And any kind of oxidant stress is first met with this. It's a scavenger, it's used up. So every time it sees an oxidant, it combines with it, neutralizes it, and is taken out in the process, which means that glutathione needs to be constantly regenerated. It's used up with each act it has in reducing oxidant stress. And this is where NADPH comes in. The NADPH is the molecule which restores the glutathione to its natural and effective state. So if we're deficient in NADPH, the glutathione levels will fall and then we'll be at risk. risk in numerous ways. We'll be at risk of genetic injury from oxidants. We'll be at risk from tissue damage, tissue necrosis, infarction, dysfunction in every way. So NADPH could not be a more important molecule. NADPH is built from NAD. So in the absence of good levels of NAD, you will not have good levels of NADPH. And therefore, you will have a lower level of glutathione.
Now, do you think it's important to take NAD or the precursors to make NAD and glutathione, or taking the precursors to make NAD is enough, and you don't also have to take glutathione?
That's right. Taking glutathione supplements is much less efficient and effective than taking the precursors of NAD, because those will drive its internal production, which is much more efficient.
And glutathione is our body's natural antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, and for detoxification. As we get older, we start losing the glutathione, I assume because our NAD is getting lower and lower, our glutathione is getting lower, and we can't protect ourselves. And ultimately, the glutathione can't protect us, and we die from different diseases. So to me, it makes sense to try to increase the NAD, to increase the glutathione, to help us live longer. Am I on track thinking like that?
Right. I mentioned there were three key areas where NAD is effective. Remember, we talked about energy, oxidant stress, and malignancy. And you're here focused on the second one. Absolutely correct. In order to maintain a strong antioxidant capability, NAD levels are required. And glutathione is the main driver of protecting us from oxidant stress. However, I should point out there are numerous other parallel mechanisms that also protect us from oxidant stress. It's not just glutathione. We have catalase, we have superoxide dismutases, and on and on. So there are many different ones, but glutathione is the key one.
And when we look at catalase, superoxide dismutase, which is secondary, I guess, to glutathione is the master, and those two are secondary. Is there any benefit of taking superoxide dismutase or catalase as a supplement?
Well, these are enzymes. They're large. We can't take them orally. They're not absorbed well. They're broken down. And many of them have to be inside the cell. They're too big to get across. So it's not possible to take superoxide dismutase or catalase supplements.
Now, you mentioned PARP, which is it's so interesting. The second most abundant protein in the nucleus after histones. So
That's right.
if you could explain about PARP and why it's so important and what it does, and how interesting it is and how it relates to NAD, as NAD is a cofactor for PARP, and how they work together.
So we first became aware of the importance of PARP in protecting our DNA really in the 80s, I would say. A gentleman named Ernst Kuhn, who was a friend of mine from Hungary, and others were the initial ones who really picked up on this. It's an abundant enzyme. And as you said, it's the second most abundant protein in the entire nucleus. And PARP is a molecule that has two functions. Its first function is to find evidence of genetic injury. So it has a part of its molecule which is looking out there. It's like a scout out there in the battlefield, looking for any evidence that there's a nick in DNA. DNA, as you know, is a helix. It's two strands of genetic polymers that are wound with each other, and they're connected by these intermolecular bonds. And what can happen is that when there's stress, and I'm talking about oxidant stress, one of the strands can be cut, can be nicked, like with the scissors, if you will. So there's one strand that's still there, but there's the strand next to it, holding onto it, has a hole. I mean, it's literally broken. It's flapping in the breeze. That's called a single strand break. And PARP is constructed in such a way that it can recognize this instantly, fantastically quickly. Once it sees that, it immediately sticks to it. It gloms right onto it like glue. And it's holding on for dear life onto that area, which is broken. And then it has as its mission to repair that and then leave. So the way it does that is once it's bound, it then looks for NAD in its environment around it, which it will find if there's sufficient NAD. And the NAD then comes in and it is attached to the PARP and then cut. The PARP cuts it and makes a long chain of this residue from NAD. It's called ADP ribose. It's a polymer. It's long, like a Christmas tree. And these things start covering the PARP, and they're all negatively charged, so that they then are repelled from the DNA and they pull the PARP away when the job is done. Imagine you have a broken pipe in your house and you call a plumber. Your goal is for him to come to the house, fix the pipe, and then leave. If he stayed forever, this wouldn't be satisfactory for many reasons. So just with PARP, it goes there, it fixes the problem, and then when all of these polymers with ADP are stuck to it, very negatively charged, and it lifts off like the lunar module, just lifts off the DNA and leaves. So, and it does that again and again and again all day. As long as there's NAD to drive this process, it all goes smoothly and we don't accumulate genetic mutations. If we don't have enough NAD, the PARP cannot do its job. And those breaks, those nicks persist. And when the cell then divides, it makes a mistake. It can't copy the material properly. The genes are not properly copied. There's no fidelity. And you get an aberrant gene. You get a mistake, what we call a mutation. If you accumulate enough of those, you're going to have a cell that can become cancerous. And this is why people with the BRCA mutation who are unable to work effectively with PARP, BRCA-sticking PARP, if they don't have that, it doesn't do its job. It comes to the house to fix the pipe and it forgot its wrench, basically. So the job doesn't get done. And unfortunately, women with BRCA mutations, they have breast cancer and ovarian cancer at a phenomenal rate. Like 70, 80% of them will go on to have a very serious malignancy. So this role of PARP in the cell, it's defending us every single day. When you look at the lake shark, I told you it lives 400 years. Well, that's a lot of cell divisions. There's a lot of time in 400 years to make a mistake and to get cancer, but they don't get cancer. And the reason they don't is they have a phenomenal amount of PARP, way like 10 times more than we do. So every second, that shark is making sure the genes are good, the genes are okay. And it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of energy. So not surprisingly, those animals are not the fastest swimmers. They are going very, very slowly all day. They don't do very much, just like a tortoise. You won't see a tortoise running a 100-yard dash, but they repair their DNA well. So their energy is directed not at being a bumblebee or a mosquito flying around everywhere, but to maintaining genomic integrity. That's why they can live so long, but they wouldn't be nominated as a first place 100-yard dash runner. Their energy is invested in keeping their genes, in good shape.
And there are animals without PARP, and they're more prone to cancer. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. If you have low levels of PARP, you have energy for other things. You can be a bumblebee and go to every flower, but, you're not going to live very long. Your genes are going to fall apart pretty quickly on you.
And was that a drug that you developed?
Well, we were very interested in what would happen in a specific type of cancer, in breast cancer, where there's BRCA deficiency. In that cell system, by removing PARP, you make the cell fall apart completely without BRCA, and they die. And that approach has worked. There is now a mainstay of therapy for triple-negative breast cancer, for ovarian cancer, a number of BRCA deficient cancers. And so our drug was the first potent PARP inhibitor that was invented, actually, way back 20 years ago, 25 years ago.
And is it still being used today?
Well, we licensed that to Genentech, and then they segued to a different drug because Abbott at the time had an orally available PARP inhibitor, and so that became the dominant one. So they didn't move forward on it after a while because Abbott came in, and it turned out, which we didn't know at the beginning, is that in order to kill breast cancer like this, you need to take this for months, many, many, many months. It's not a one-shot thing. So the oral bioavailability became critical from a commercial and convenience perspective. And so our drug was more for IV. It was tended as an IV, and ultimately an oral drug was required for this long chronic therapy.
And it's still used today. And is it?
It's the mainstay of breast cancer. It's absolutely, yep.
MacuHealth, your science-born and tested solutions for visual performance, macular degeneration, and dry eye syndrome. New products coming soon. Embrace the science.
And did they have any research on how long it extends life for people with that type of breast cancer?
Well, it cures breast cancer.
It cures it.
They're the Yeah, the people who respond to PARP inhibitors are cured.
Beautiful. Now, the third function was it saves us from cancer, NAD. And I guess it kind of relates to what you were just talking about. Is there anything else that's involved in that?
Uh, you mean outside of cancer? Any other purposes?
No, no, NAD saving us for cancer, the third function. And we were just talking about PARP and saving cancer. Is there any other mechanism involved with NAD and cancer?
Yes, to the extent that it's an antioxidant and it's preventing genetic injury, yes. We were the first to point out back in 1995 that one of the key oxidants in the body called peroxynitrite, which is even more potent than hydrogen peroxide, it's a really nasty oxidant, that this can cause a lot of genetic injury. And that genetic injury causes all types of damage. It can kill the cell or it can actually cause mutations. And so, in that sense, by NAD removing these oxidants and preventing stress and damage to the genes, you actually can preempt the formation of cancer, right? Because you're actually preventing the mutations that ultimately will go on to form cancer. So, in two ways, it can prevent cancer by preventing the damage initially, and then secondarily helping PARP to repair whatever damage has occurred.
Now, talk to me about people's symptoms of having low NAD. What kind of symptoms? Low energy, persistent fatigue, exercise intolerance, muscle weakness. Tell us about some of the many symptoms. I guess NAD is involved in like 400 enzymatic reactions in the body. So there's a lot of symptoms, I assume. So if you could talk about some of the most common ones.
I think the first one we would start with is really energy. Every single molecule of ATP that's formed in our body, and that's the ultimate energetic currency that we use, every single one of those depends on NAD for its formation. So as we age and we have lower levels of NAD, we're going to see quite the fall off in production of ATP. And therefore, when we go to run down the basketball court or try to swim a lap, really any kind of physical exertion, we just are not generating ATPs at the level that we were before, and we can't sustain vigorous activity. Our ability to walk fast, to run, to climb, all of these motor skills are going to be slowed down. So that's the first one. But there are other places that energy is important that we may not think of it in quite that way, like cognition. The brain is actually the most energy demanding organ in our body. The brain uses a phenomenal amount of energy. 25% of our blood flow goes to our brain for this reason. And so once we have low NAD levels, our ability to think, to analyze, to understand, to remember, to function at a high level cognitively will start to decline. And you talked about brain fog, and that's sort of a good way of talking about it. It's not a dementia like Alzheimer's or something like that, but it's a slowing down. We're not as sharp and as fast. We don't remember as well. We're unable to react as quickly. And that's obviously noticeable as people age. So energy is a key thing there. When we look at digestion, extremely energetically requiring process. So people who are really older, they're not able to, digest their food as fast. When we look at endocrine function, whether it's in the ovary or whether it's in other organs, but let's take the ovary as a specific example. The ovary is a very high energy requiring tissue. It has to nurture eggs there for 30, 40 years after the baby is born. They have to have good genomic integrity. They can't have gene damage. It has to be repaired. They have to produce follicles every month. They have to hatch these follicles. There's a huge, the uterus has to be prepared. There's an enormous amount going on in the ovary. And if you look at the levels of NAD in the ovary, by the time you're at midlife, they're much lower than when you're, say, in your 20s. And therefore, eventually, you get what's called ovarian failure. It's more commonly known as menopause. But that is a direct result of having lost this critical NAD that keeps the ovary functioning at a good level. If you were to prevent that, if you were to sustain good NAD levels in the ovary, as have been done experimentally in mice, you can see that they can remain fertile and have large litters even to an old age, the equivalent, say, of a 90-year-old in a human, but their menopause is delayed. They remain fertile and active and are able to have babies, even into, say, their 90s, an equivalent. That's an example of a very important organ. The eye, the retina, for example, is the most oxygen-consuming tissue in our entire body. Hard to believe that, but vision is incredibly energy demanding. And what we see in the retina as we look at animals, where this has been very carefully analyzed, there's a loss over time in the retina of NAD. It's quite impressive. And so the ability to recycle and restart the photoreceptors and to see properly starts to fail. And as that happens, we see a diminution in our visual acuity, and then there are diseases that can happen, whether it's AMD or diabetic retinopathy. All of these diabetes, of course, accentuates this whole process. So the eye is particularly important on the retina. NAD levels are very important in the front of the eye in terms of protecting our cornea and protecting the lens from cataracts, in protecting the side of our eye, the trabecular meshwork, which governs the fluid that leaves our eye so we don't get glaucoma. All of these are highly dependent. Another area that's really important is our blood vessels. Our blood vessels need to be able to dilate so that we don't have high blood pressure. They need to be able to move and open up when we need more blood flow. All of that is dependent on having a healthy internal layer, the endothelium of our blood vessels. Well, what governs that? What opens and closes that? That's governed by nitric oxide. And the way nitric oxide is produced in that tissue is from nitric oxide synthase. It's an enzyme that makes nitric oxide. That enzyme has an absolute requirement for NADPH. If you remove NADPH, there's no nitric oxide at all, zero. NADPH is made from NAD. So as our NAD levels fall, our NADPH levels also fall. And therefore, our blood vessels have less nitric oxide synthase that's working. They make less nitric oxide. And therefore, as we get older, it's not surprising that high blood pressure is common. And the older you get, the more common it gets. When you take people in their 70s and 80s, it's very common to see hypertension. And this is because of a nitric oxide deficiency. When we look, for example, at sexual function, this is almost entirely connected with nitric oxide. That's why Viagra became so important and went on the market. It's actually sustaining and maintaining the effect of nitric oxide. That's how it works. So for males, over time, as NAD levels fall and NADPH falls, nitric oxide synthase doesn't work so well, they have erectile dysfunction. And then when you support the NAD levels or when you build back the nitric oxide with Viagra, you can restore some erectile dysfunction. In females, it's even more important. I mentioned the ovary, but in terms of sexual function, like males, all of this is dependent on nitric oxide, the clitoral engorgement, the arousal, the vaginal extension, all of this, the vaginal lubrication. We published a number of papers on this in animals where we showed that as nitric oxide levels fall, all of the female sexual dysfunction emerges. So along with the ovarian issue, we now have the sexual dysfunction in females, all connected to NAD. So it's really touching almost every single organ and tissue that you can think of because they're all using energy, protecting themselves from cancer, from oxidants, producing nitric oxide. All this is bound up with the role of NAD, critical molecule.
How about headaches, weight gain? We talked about blood vessels. Well, people would have Raynaud's, cold hands and feet, insulin resistance. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, each of those is a separate story. But for example, in Raynaud's phenomenon, you have a problem where in the fingers and also in the toes, they're not getting enough blood flow. Why? Because the blood vessels are not dilating. They're not bringing in enough blood. And why aren't they dilating? Because they don't have the nitric oxide there to open up the blood vessels. If you provide nitric oxide as a cream, you will see them turn pink. You'll see good blood flow. So it's definitely nitric oxide dependent. So an individual who has very low NADPH, very low NAD, is going to be more susceptible to these kinds of vascular insufficiency in their extremities, particularly the fingers and the toes. It's a very important problem that you brought up. In the case of diabetes, that's even more interesting. The sensitivity of tissues to insulin is also a special process in which NAD has a role. And more than that, the high glucose that is, of course, associated with diabetes forms oxidants, and they cause peroxynitrite formation in the cell and genetic injury. We were the first actually to publish on this in Nature in 96. And there, you can prevent the damage from diabetes by restoring the NAD levels. So that was a very clear example where NAD deficiency tag teams with diabetes to cause tissue damage.
How about wrinkles? People that get premature wrinkles, sagging skin, eczema. How is that involved?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because that's one of the things that we've noticed so much with our particular product. Um, the skin of a young person looks so different from a 90-year-old. I mean, I can't even begin to describe the changes. You have changes in spots, and you have the tissue elasticity, the turgor, the resilience of a 6-year-old skin looks brand new. And yet, when you get to an older person, you have all these wrinkles and all of that. That's caused by a change in the levels within the skin of various proteins, which give it its elasticity. There's actually a protein called elastin, and the elastin levels fall with age. And you also see changes in hyaluronic acid, which provide for the hydration of the skin. Collagen levels tend to diminish, so you have sagging of skin, and all of that is somehow related to NAD in terms of the ability of the cells that are producing these to have the energy to drive production of those proteins. So we produce less and less and less. By the time we're 80, we don't have much elastin in the skin. And you can see immediately when you look at an 80-year-old that their skin has changed. Same thing with the appendages of the skin. We look at hair. Why do we have a change in, why do we have a change in the color of our hairs? Why do we get gray hair? Why do we get white hair? Well, the follicle of the hair, which is of course sitting in the skin, it's an appendage of the skin. That follicle has to produce healthy hair and has to inject pigment into it, whether it's red hair or black hair or blonde hair. It's injecting a pigment, which is a lovely color. The ability to do that is dependent on the energy processes in the follicle itself. And as it weakens and becomes NAD deficient, it doesn't inject the pigment. It doesn't even make the hair properly. It becomes thinner. So as old people age, their hair, instead of being a thick, vibrant mane of hair, suddenly it's thin and fragile, brittle. All of these changes are an energetic failure confined to that follicle. So it's not just the skin as a whole, but it's even the follicle. Within the skin, we have various proteins that are made that or not made that govern its texture, its color. So as people age, they get melanin production. These are the brown spots you see with aging. Again, that is a function of the energy within the skin. And that's another comment that we've heard back from our customers about changes in the appearance of the skin, less brown spots.
Interesting. Now, if somebody is getting gray hair prematurely, is taking precursors and increasing NAD, is that something that could be reversed? Or somebody that's getting bald early, they're taking NAD precursors, has it been shown that that could be prevented or slowed down?
That hasn't been examined in a clinical trial, but in animal studies, you will see an improvement in the skin quality, the texture, the elasticity, and the hair color, and the hair quality when you have NAD supplementation. So NAD looks like it could be an important practical way to maintain the integrity of our appearance, the beauty, if you will, but that has not been rigorously examined in man.
But it has been reported by some of the customers of yours that,
Oh, yes, yes. Those are not proper clinical trials,
right,
but
but
that's
HBOT has been reversed, right?
we've received feedback. We've received feedback, yes.
So I'm going to ask you a question about medication that lower NAD, statins, chemo drugs, blood pressure prednisone, uh, antivirals, some antibiotics. Talk to me about medications that may lower NAD levels or that do lower NAD levels.
Well, some of them have been associated with a fall off in NAD, but the evidence is a little bit sparse. I wouldn't say there's really hardcore data proving that there's a big decrement in NAD, but a lot of them will affect that process. I mean, NAD is right at the core, as I say, of the entire cellular machinery for intermediary metabolism. So many of these drugs will negatively impact on that, but not to the extent that they would cause aging. There may be a temporary reduction, but it's not that significant. The major drivers of NAD decline are built into us, and they are really two factors. One, we're not making enough. The reason for this is that there are several enzymes, or three, that produce NAD. And as you age in certain tissues, there's less and less and less of these enzymes, particularly in the retina. We were talking about that before, in the back of the eye. So as you age, you see a fall off in the amount of these enzymes. But even more worrisome, there are other enzymes that are appearing that are breaking up the NAD and destroying it. So we have problems both in production, but more importantly, we have problems in removal. We have enzymes that, as their job, they break down NAD. That's what they do. And the most important one, by far, the one that's getting all the excitement right now, is CD38. Everybody seems to be talking about that. And for me, I mean, PARP was very exciting to me as a young scientist in the 1990s, but now I would say the most exciting enzyme, exciting target at all in biology for me is CD38, because I really believe this holds the key to most of what we call aging. The CD38 is present everywhere. It's in many of our cells, certainly in our immune cells, but it's present in almost every cell. And it's both inside the cells and also on their surface. And it will grab onto NAD wherever it sees it and cut it in half, just destroys it, wipes it out. Now, there's always a low level of this enzyme. We're born with it. It's okay. We need it. It's got some healthy roles. But unfortunately, sadly, as we age, the levels suddenly go up and up and up. By the time we're in our 50s and 60s, we're loaded with it. As we get even older, it's even higher. And this it wreaks havoc. It lowers the NAD very, very fast. So that if you take a mouse or a person, take a mouse that's very old, and you give them a big supplement, NAD supplement, could be NMN, it could be NR, you'll see the levels go up. Yes, the levels of NAD will rise, and then they'll quickly fall down. Why? Because as soon as that stuff is there, this enzyme's just everywhere, and it's cutting. So if we understood why this enzyme is made, why there's more of it, and how to stop that, we would have a way to block a lot of the aging process. We would slow it down significantly. There are now animal models which don't have CD38. You can engineer them, take out the gene for it, so it doesn't make CD38. Those animals look a whole lot different. I mean, you can take a mouse that's, should be in a wheelchair, if you will, if mice got to that point, and it's running around, it's active, it's got normal eating behavior, cognitive behavior. If you take an ovary in that mouse, which doesn't have CD38, they can have litters when they're literally like 90 years of age, equivalent. All of the functions, the photoreceptors in the eye, if you remove huge amounts of CD38 in the aged eye, if you remove that, use a mouse that doesn't have it, their vision's like a young mouse. So there's both the creation of NAD and its sustenance or maintenance. And we had to look at both of these. And when we designed our product, we weren't just thinking about giving more, but also preventing the fall, preventing the removal. And so we have a mixture, actually, of ingredients. It's not just NMN, which is a supplement, but we also have natural materials in there which retard the activity or the expression of CD38. So we're trying to jack up the levels and prevent the decrement.
Let me ask you about CD38 before we get into the supplement and discuss it. because that's CD38 is really fascinating to me because it helps fight infection. And when we're younger, we have like the right amount of CD38. But as we get older, we have too much CD38. It kind of gets out of proportion. And CD38 is used for immune cell activation, T cell, B cells, natural killer cells, neutrophils. So we need some CD38, but it has when we're getting too much, we get autoimmune disease because it causes the immune system to overreact. So we're at risk for lupus or rheumatoid arthritis, MS, and even certain types of cancers like multiple myeloma. So so it's an important part of the immune system, and this is a theoretical question, and I wonder if you've ever thought about it. But why do you think this important molecule, CD38, which we need because it helps our immune system and it causes the immune cells to be activated, and then as we get older, it overreacts. But why do you think the body has used CD38 to degrade NAD? Why does that, why would the body do that? There has to be a reason for that. Why do you think, I don't know if you ever thought about it, but it's something I've thought about and I don't understand why
Sure.
that would happen.
Let me explain the way CD38 works. CD38 binds NAD, sticks to it. There's a specific amino acid that we know very well that attaches to NAD in the cell. And then it cleaves it in such a way that it forms a ring. So it causes this, it's called cyclic ADP ribose. It actually creates a derivative of NAD called cyclic ADP ribose. And that molecule is a signaling molecule. It tells the cell to release calcium from inside the cell, from certain parts of the cell. So the reason it works in immune function is it's increasing the calcium in immune cells, which then triggers an immune response. Okay, so we need that signaling event to fight infection. So it's got a role, no doubt. The problem is, and it's fine. I mean, when you're 15 years old or 20 years old, great. It's a good signaling molecule that does its thing. Everyone is happy. Problem is, evolution, historically, we didn't live beyond the ages of 25 or 30 until a few thousand years ago. Even recently, people lived in their 40s. Evolution did not take into account the role of CD38 in an 80-year-old. There were no 80-year-olds during evolutionary development. Now, it turns out that the regulation of CD38 expression, what controls how much of it that you make, is governed by inflammation. So if you have very little inflammation, you're young, you're 15 years old, you're not inflamed, all is good, you make a little bit of CD38. But what happens suddenly if you have a lot of inflammation? You're making GADs of this, too much of this. And at that point, it's consuming NAD, not just for a signaling purpose, but it's just wiping it out. It's taking out the NAD. So why would we have more inflammation when we're 50 or 60 or 70 or 80? Why does an 80-year-old have more inflammation than a 15-year-old? What's the reason? Well, the probable reason, what is the driver of inflammation as we age, is the gut. And we have a wonderful, very, very long intestine to absorb our food. It's tens of yards long, and we are eating everything, and we have trillions of bacteria within our colon, trillions, literally. But not one of them, hopefully, will cross over and leave the inside of the intestine and jump into us, into our blood. If that were to happen, we would have what's called a bacteremia. If it got worse, it would be a sepsis. We would die. So the intestine has evolved an incredibly amazing tight encapsulation or barrier that holds these bacteria, trillions of them, in our colon and does not let them cross over. And that system is governed by a lot of proteins which hold the cells together really tightly. We call that the tight junction. Now, as we age, that tight junction starts to fail. It gets leaky. A little bit at first, a lot later. You take an 80-year-old person, their gut is a lot leakier than a 10-year-old, much more so. So bacteria and bacterial products like their cell wall LPS and other parts of their cell wall, endotoxin, they get loose. They go into the body, they go into the blood, they circulate. And the body says, well, we have an infection probably. We have these products, they shouldn't be there. All hands on deck. We're going to have inflammation to fight off the invader. And that causes inflammation. And that inflammation radiates everywhere in us. And CD8 everywhere goes up, whether it's the ovary or the back of the eye or the muscle or the brain. It's all going up. So as we get older and our gut starts to fail, we are getting inflamed. Aging, in this context, we can actually call aging an inflammatory disease. Or if you don't like the word disease, we can say we get inflamed when we get older. We don't have to call it a disease. It's part and parcel of living, but we do get inflamed. And that inflammation is responsible for obesity. It's responsible for the high blood pressure. All of these things where our NAD levels start to fall ultimately are driven from our gut, from inflammation.
And we get the big belly and
everything's going, yeah.
MacuHealth is a nutritional supplement leader. Our targeted formulas include MacuHealth for daily eye health, MacuHealth Plus for aging eye support, Vitreous Health for vitreous care, Vision Edge Pro for visual performance in athletes, TG Omega-3 for ocular and systemic wellness, and MacuHealth DM for eye and metabolic support. Call MacuHealth today and mention this podcast for special discounts. Experience the difference with MacuHealth. Nutrition you can see.
with more screen usage and indoor time, myopia, also known as nearsightedness, is increasing and getting worse in children. Now, certified eye doctors can prescribe MiSight One Day, the first and only FDA-approved soft contact lens to slow myopia progression in age-appropriate children. Visit CooperVision.com to find a Brilliant Futures certified eye doctor near you. Do your patients know what presbyopia is?
There are people who are afraid of the press.
Have you talked to your patients about multifocal contact lenses?
I've heard the bifocal, but not multifocal.
Exactly, not multifocal.
Do you need help with your multifocal strategy? Learn more at the conclusion of this episode.